Nathaniel Grant sat behind the wheel of his sleek black car, the rain pounding against the windshield as he navigated through the dark streets of Los Angeles. The city was alive, even under the stormy clouds, with the hum of distant traffic and the occasional flash of neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Nathaniel, a successful entrepreneur in the tech industry, had everything most people dreamed of: wealth, power, and the kind of status that opened doors without question. Yet, none of it filled the empty space in his chest. As he drove, his thoughts wandered, reflecting on the emptiness that gnawed at him despite his outward success. He had everything, yet felt like nothing. His latest venture had just seen another huge profit margin, but something about the deal left him cold. Perhaps it was the hollow praise from his peers, the shallow congratulations that didn't reach him. He thought back to his childhood, when he had dreamed of making a real difference in the world, a world that now seemed to be spinning on the axis of greed and indifference. Then, as if the universe itself was offering him a chance to break free from the monotony of his life, something unexpected caught his attention. A flash of movement at the corner of his eye. He slammed his foot on the brake, the car screeching to a halt. A figure huddled against a brick wall, just beneath the awning of a closed store, shivering in the downpour. A young girl. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. He blinked in disbelief, wondering if the storm had played tricks on his mind. But no. There she was, barely visible under the dim streetlights, holding something in her arms. The rain soaked her hair, plastering it to her face, and her clothes were ragged, torn by time and hardship. Her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, met his for a brief moment before she lowered her gaze, clutching the bundle tightly in her arms. Without thinking, Nathaniel opened the door and rushed toward her. His expensive shoes splashed through the puddles, but he didn't care. He knelt beside her, careful not to startle her further. "Hey," he said softly, his voice breaking through the noise of the storm. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond immediately. She flinched at the sound of his voice, her body tense like a frightened animal. Nathaniel's gaze fell to the small bundle she was holding. A baby, no more than a year old, wrapped in a dirty blanket. The baby was shivering as badly as she was, his small face pale and fragile. "I won't hurt you," Nathaniel continued, his voice gentle, trying to offer comfort. "Are you lost? Where's your family?" The girl slowly looked up at him, her eyes filled with both fear and desperation. "They left us," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost drowned out by the rain. I don't know where to go." Nathaniel's stomach turned. The rawness of her words hit him like a punch. He glanced around, but there was no one else in sight. No one to help her. No one to make sure she was safe. "Come with me," he said, holding out his hand. "We'll get you somewhere safe." The girl hesitated, but, with a quick glance down at the baby, she took his hand, her fingers trembling. Nathaniel carefully helped her to her feet, keeping one hand on her shoulder for support as they walked back to his car. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, but Nathaniel couldn't help but feel like he had been pulled into something far bigger than a random act of kindness. As they reached the car, he opened the door for her and helped her inside. The baby, still bundled in her arms, let out a faint cry. Nathaniel's heart ached at the sound. There was no time to waste. "Let's get you both warm," he said as he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. He glanced over at the girl, whose wide eyes were now studying him with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. "What's your name?" "Mia," she replied quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "And the baby?" Nathaniel asked, glancing at the small child in her arms. "Leo," Mia whispered, her eyes filling with a quiet sorrow. Nathaniel nodded, his mind already racing. What kind of situation had these children been left in? And why had they been abandoned in the middle of a storm? He didn't have answers yet, but he was determined to find them. Nathaniel drove for what seemed like hours, his mind consumed with questions and concerns. Mia and Leo sat in silence beside him, the baby occasionally whimpering, but Mia remained mostly still, her eyes focused on the road ahead. She was lost in her thoughts, a haunting emptiness in her gaze. Nathaniel knew the road to healing wouldn't be easy for her, but he was ready to help in any way he could. As they reached the outskirts of downtown, Nathaniel spotted a small, cozy cafe with a warm glow emanating from the windows. Mrs. Harper's Cafe was a local favorite, known for its strong coffee and comforting atmosphere. He had passed it countless times but never stopped in. Today, it felt like the perfect place to take refuge. Nathaniel pulled into the parking lot and parked in front of the cafe. He turned off the engine and quickly got out, rushing to open the door for Mia. She stepped out cautiously, her grip still tight on Leo, but she followed him inside. The cafe was a haven of warmth, the smell of fresh pastries and coffee filling the air. Mrs. Harper, the owner, was behind the counter, wiping down the surface with a rag. Her warm smile faded when she saw the disheveled girl and baby standing in the doorway. "Can I help you, sir?" Mrs. Harper asked, her eyes shifting to Mia and Leo. Nathaniel nodded. "We need to get them something warm, maybe some blankets. And if you have a place where they can rest for a while, that would be great." Mrs. Harper's expression softened as she glanced at Mia. "Of course. Come on in, sweetie. You and your brother can sit by the fire. I'll bring you some hot chocolate." Mia hesitated, but eventually followed Mrs. Harper, carrying Leo in her arms. Nathaniel stood at the counter, watching them as they settled into a corner booth near the fireplace. He could see how tired Mia was, how her shoulders sagged with the weight of the world. As he sat down across from her, Mrs. Harper brought over 2 mugs of hot chocolate and a plate of warm cookies. Mia didn't reach for the drink right away, instead staring at the mug as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Nathaniel broke the silence first. "Mia, can you tell me what happened? Where are you from? Why were you out there alone with Leo?" Mia's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and she lowered her gaze. "We came from an orphanage," she whispered. "It's called Sunrise Haven. They told us we would be safe there, but then they left us. I don't know why. We were supposed to have a family, but we didn't. And then they told me that we couldn't stay anymore. They said we had to leave." Nathaniel's heart sank. An orphanage? How could they have treated her like that? His mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of Mia's story. Something wasn't right. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice soft with compassion. "But you're safe now. I'll make sure of it." Mia finally took a sip of her hot chocolate, but she didn't seem comforted. The shadows in her eyes remained, and Nathaniel knew that this was only the beginning of uncovering the truth. As the warmth of the cafe began to seep into Mia's bones, she started to relax. The tension in her shoulders loosened, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she allowed herself to sit still. Leo, in her arms, had fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Nathaniel sat across from her, his mind still racing with questions. The more she had shared, the more disturbed he became. An orphanage? Abandoned on the streets? It made no sense. Mia, noticing the concern on his face, lowered her gaze again. She was hesitant to speak, but Nathaniel could tell there was more. "Mia," he said gently, "if there's more to your story, you can tell me. I want to help." For a long moment, Mia didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. But then, in a small voice, she whispered, "Some of the kids, they disappeared. They never came back." Nathaniel leaned forward, his heart thudding in his chest. "What do you mean? Where did they go?" Mia shuddered, her fingers tightening around Leo. "I don't know. They were just gone. One day, they were there, and the next day, they weren't. No one talked about it, and when I asked, they told me to be quiet. But I saw them take the kids out late at night. They said it was a special program, but I don't believe them." Nathaniel's mind raced. This was no ordinary orphanage. He had to find out the truth. "Mia, do you know the name of the person in charge? Who runs this place?" Mia hesitated again, then whispered, "Eliza Cross. She's the one who told us to leave." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. Eliza Cross. He had heard that name before. He needed to find out everything he could about this woman and the orphanage. Something told him this was just the tip of the iceberg. As he stood to leave, determined to get to the bottom of this, Mia's voice stopped him. "Please, don't let them hurt my brother." Nathaniel turned to her, his resolve hardening. "I won't let anything happen to either of you. I promise. As he walked out of the cafe, Nathaniel knew one thing for certain. Mia and Leo's lives were about to change, and he was going to make sure they had a future, free from whatever darkness had shadowed their past. Nathaniel couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had settled in his chest as he drove back to his office. The cafe was behind him now, but the weight of Mia's words, the disappearances, the fear in her eyes, stayed with him. He had to dig deeper. This couldn't just be an isolated incident, not with what Mia had shared. Something darker was at play here, and he had to find out what. Back at his sleek office, Nathaniel opened his laptop and began his search. He was methodical, relentless in his approach. The name, Sunrise Haven, kept resurfacing in the local news, mostly in connection with positive stories about its mission to help orphan children, but there was something beneath the surface that didn't sit right. As he combed through the orphanage's records, he found a pattern, one that should have been cause for alarm. There were no criminal records, no public accusations, no lawsuits filed against the institution. On paper, Sunrise Haven appeared to be a well-run, reputable place. But then he saw something that made him stop. A name, Jeffrey Reed. He had been an employee at Sunrise Haven until 6 months ago, when he was suddenly dismissed under unclear circumstances. A quick search through local news articles revealed nothing about his firing, but Nathaniel's gut told him it was far more significant than a simple personnel change. His fingers flew over the keyboard, tracking down Jeffrey's last known address. When he found it, he didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and dialed Detective Jacobs, the seasoned investigator who had helped him in the past with several high-profile cases. "Jacobs, I need your help. There's something off about Sunrise Haven, and I need to find out everything I can about it. There's a man named Jeffrey Reed. He worked there. I need you to find him." "On it," Jacobs replied, his tone professional, yet with the understanding that Nathaniel wasn't going to rest until he got answers. Nathaniel set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts churning. Sunrise Haven wasn't just a random orphanage. It was a front, a carefully crafted facade hiding something far more sinister. Mia's story about the children disappearing, the secret late-night activities, they weren't just paranoia. They were warning signs. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that there was an underground network of people using orphanages like Sunrise Haven to exploit vulnerable children. As he waited for Jacobs to get back to him, Nathaniel's thoughts returned to Mia and Leo. He had promised Mia he would protect them. He couldn't let them fall through the cracks of a broken system. The following afternoon, Nathaniel met up with Detective Jacobs at a quiet, nondescript cafe on the outskirts of the city. Nathaniel couldn't afford to waste time or alert anyone to his investigation. The stakes were too high, and if they were going to find out the truth behind Sunrise Haven, they had to keep everything low profile. Jacobs slid into the booth across from him, a manila envelope in hand. "I tracked down Jeffrey Reed," Jacobs said, his voice hushed. "He's been hiding out for the past few weeks, staying in a rundown apartment on the west side of town. He's scared, Nathaniel. Really scared." "Why?" Nathaniel asked, leaning forward. "What happened? What's he hiding?" Jacobs opened the envelope and slid a few papers across the table. "This is what we found. Jeffrey was fired after he tried to report something. He witnessed what he believed was child trafficking going on at Sunrise Haven. He tried to go to the authorities, but someone threatened him. Someone powerful." Nathaniel's heart sank. Child trafficking? It was the worst-case scenario, the one thing he had been afraid of but hadn't wanted to believe. It all started to make sense now. The late-night activities Mia had mentioned, the disappearances of the children, the sense of fear that hung over the place. He tried to get out, but they made sure he wouldn't, Jacobs continued, his voice grim. "There's a document here, signed by Eliza Cross, stating that Jeffrey was terminated for misconduct, but there's no further explanation. The problem is, no one has ever been able to investigate her, not really. She's too connected." Nathaniel stared at the documents, his mind working through the possibilities. He had seen this kind of thing before. People in power using their influence to hide their secrets. Eliza Cross wasn't just running an orphanage. She was orchestrating something much bigger, something that involved a network of people willing to do anything to protect their operation. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists. "We need to find Jeffrey." Now, we need to hear what he knows before it's too late. Nathaniel couldn't afford to waste any more time. Every minute that passed meant more children were potentially at risk. With Jacobs on his side, they set out to find Jeffrey Reed, hoping that the terrified former employee would finally speak out and confirm their suspicions. But Nathaniel knew they weren't the only ones searching for him. They arrived at the rundown apartment complex, a grim, concrete structure that had seen better days. The rain had stopped, but the cold had set in, making everything feel darker and more oppressive. As they approached Jeffrey's door, Nathaniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. "Yeah?" he answered, his voice sharp. "Mr. Grant." Mrs. Harper's voice came through. "Mia, she's asking for you. She said it's urgent." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." He hung up and looked at Jacobs. "I need to make a quick detour. Stay on Jeffrey's trail. I'll catch up." Jacobs gave a curt nod, and Nathaniel hurried back to his car. The urgency in Mia's voice made his stomach twist with worry. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel the danger closing in. When he arrived at Mrs. Harper's cafe, Mia was sitting at the same booth by the fire, but this time, her expression was different. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She wasn't alone. Leo was in her arms, but he wasn't the same. His little face was flushed, and he was shivering uncontrollably. "What's wrong?" Nathaniel asked, rushing to her side. Mia looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "It's Leo. He won't stop shaking. He's burning up." "Nathaniel, I don't know what's happening." Nathaniel immediately pulled out his phone and called for an ambulance. As he waited, he noticed something strange. A small bruise on Leo's arm, barely visible under the sleeve of his shirt. It wasn't just the fever. Something wasn't right, and Nathaniel's heart sank as he realized what it might be. "Did anyone touch him?" Nathaniel asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Mia shook her head, but her expression betrayed her fear. "I don't know. I don't think so. I don't know what's happening." The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, and Nathaniel knew this was no coincidence. Someone had hurt Leo. Someone who had access to the children at Sunrise Haven. As the paramedics arrived and rushed Leo to the hospital, Nathaniel turned to Mia. "You're not going back there, Mia. I won't let them hurt you or Leo." She nodded, her face pale and filled with both relief and fear. Nathaniel had made a vow to protect them, and he would do whatever it took to make sure no one else fell victim to the same horrors. They were running out of time, but Nathaniel wasn't going to stop until the truth was exposed. As the days passed, the tension in Nathaniel's chest grew heavier. The sense of urgency had never been more pressing. Mia and Leo were safe for now, but the true scale of the operation behind Sunrise Haven was still a mystery. The network that Nathaniel and Detective Jacobs had uncovered seemed vast, its reach insidious. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous things became. And Nathaniel knew they were walking a fine line between uncovering the truth and putting themselves in even greater danger. But time was running out. Nathaniel knew Eliza Cross wasn't just running an orphanage. She was managing a well-oiled machine, trafficking children and selling them to the highest bidders. If they were going to stop her and her operation, they needed concrete proof, something that would expose the whole network. Detective Jacobs had informed Nathaniel of a new lead. He had managed to tap into a police informant who had recently overheard some conversations among the men working for Eliza. A shipment of children was being moved in 2 days, and Nathaniel believed this would be their best chance to stop the operation once and for all. As Jacobs laid out the details of the plan, Nathaniel's mind raced. The plan was risky, and every detail had to go off without a hitch. They had to get to the location before the children were transferred, before the corrupt officers and their handlers had a chance to cover their tracks. "I've got an undercover unit ready," Jacobs said, laying a map on the table. "We'll have eyes on every exit, but we need to move fast. Once the children are out, it'll be almost impossible to track them down." Nathaniel studied the map, tracing the path he would need to take to intercept the convoy. He glanced up at Jacobs. "And if they're expecting us?" Jacobs smirked, his eyes hardening. "They won't. We've got the element of surprise on our side." The plan was set, and the next 48 hours would determine whether they would be able to rescue the children and dismantle the trafficking ring, or whether they would be too late. Nathaniel met with Mia that evening, updating her on the plan. She still looked exhausted, her concern for Leo clear on her face. The doctors were still monitoring his condition, trying to determine whether there was any lasting damage from whatever had caused his fever and the strange bruise on his arm. "I don't want to put you in danger, Mia," Nathaniel said gently, sitting across from her. "But we can't let them continue doing this. We have to take them down." Mia's eyes, still haunted by fear and worry for her brother, met his. "I know," she said softly, "but promise me, Nathaniel, if something happens, you'll make sure Leo is safe." "I promise," he said, his voice firm. "You both are safe, and we'll make sure no one else gets hurt." The next 2 days felt like an eternity. Nathaniel barely slept, the weight of the mission hanging over him. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was palpable. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when they were so close. The night of the raid arrived. Nathaniel stood in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, the sound of his heartbeat echoing in his ears. The cold air bit into his skin as he checked his watch. The convoy was expected to move in the next 30 minutes. His team of officers were scattered across the area, hidden in the darkness, prepared to act at a moment's notice. Nathaniel's pulse quickened as he glanced at Jacobs, who stood a few feet away, watching the perimeter. "We're ready," Jacobs said quietly. "Once we get eyes on them, we move in." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze shifting to the dark road ahead. He could hear the distant hum of engines. His breath caught in his throat as a series of vans came into view, moving silently toward the warehouse. The children, the ones they'd been desperately trying to save, were in those vans. Without a word, the team sprung into action, surrounding the vehicles in a well-executed maneuver. The surprise was complete. The traffickers had no idea what was coming. Nathaniel's heart hammered in his chest as he and Jacobs approached the lead van, ready to make their move. The door of the van swung open, and Nathaniel's eyes locked onto the terrified faces of the children inside. Some of them were no older than Leo, their eyes wide with fear. He could see the bruises, the marks of neglect, and the signs that they had been through far too much for children so young. His stomach twisted, and for a moment, he couldn't move. These children, these innocent lives, had been treated like property, like pawns in a disgusting game of exploitation. But there was no time to dwell on the horror. With a command, the officers rushed forward, securing the van and taking down the traffickers who were trying to escape. It was over in moments, but it felt like hours. Nathaniel's focus shifted as he approached the second van, where more children were being unloaded. He didn't know how many were still inside, but his heart broke with every face he saw. He couldn't help but wonder, how many had already been sold? How many were lost forever? "Get them out of here," Jacobs barked to his team, motioning toward the children. "Take them to safety." Nathaniel turned to face Eliza Cross, who had been arrested in the chaos. Her expression was a mixture of fury and disbelief as she was handcuffed, struggling against the officers holding her. She glared at Nathaniel, her eyes filled with venom. "You think you've won?" she spat, her voice low and dangerous. "This is only the beginning. You'll never stop us." Nathaniel's gaze never wavered. "You're done, Eliza. It's over." The raid was a success. The children had been rescued, and several key members of the trafficking ring had been arrested. But even as Nathaniel watched the authorities lead Eliza Cross away in handcuffs, he knew the fight wasn't over. Her network was vast, and there were still many pieces of the puzzle left to uncover. The following days were a blur of police reports, interviews, and courtroom preparations. Nathaniel worked closely with Jacobs and the legal team, trying to piece together the full extent of the operation and make sure Eliza's accomplices didn't slip through the cracks. But as the trial for Eliza Cross loomed, Nathaniel knew there was something more he had to do. He had made a promise to Mia and Leo, and he intended to keep it. Despite the immense pressure and the weight of his responsibilities, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that his role in all of this was far from over. In a quiet moment, as he stood at the window of his office overlooking the city, Nathaniel made a decision. He would not just be a bystander in this fight for justice. He would take it further. He would make sure no child would ever be abandoned again. As the trial began, Nathaniel stood firm, his resolve solidifying with every passing day. The children who had been saved, Mia, Leo, and the others, were only the beginning. He had a new mission now. It wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about creating a world where children like them would never be exploited again. And he would fight until that world was a reality. The weeks following the raid were a whirlwind of legal battles, media coverage, and the constant weight of what Nathaniel had helped uncover. The children were safe, but the process of their recovery was just beginning. Mia, Leo, and the others were now in protective custody, being provided with the care and attention they had been denied for so long. As for Nathaniel, he was consumed by the aftermath of the operation. His work with the authorities wasn't done. There were still more arrests to be made, more lives to be saved. But his thoughts often drifted back to Mia and Leo. They had been through more than any child should ever experience, and yet they were resilient, holding on to the hope that there was still a better life waiting for them. It was late one evening when Nathaniel received a call from Mrs. Harper, the kind-hearted cafe owner who had been a lifeline to Mia during their darkest hours. "Nathaniel, I think you should come by," she said, her voice soft but urgent. When Nathaniel arrived, he found Mia sitting by the window, a quiet smile on her face as she watched Leo play with a small toy. The transformation was almost unreal. Leo's eyes no longer held the wide, fearful expression of a child who had seen too much. He was laughing, the sound bright and pure, something Nathaniel hadn't heard from him before. Mia looked up as Nathaniel entered. She had the same quiet smile on her face, but there was a new strength in her posture, a new sense of peace that hadn't been there when they first met. "I wanted to thank you," Mia said softly, "for everything you've done, for saving us, for giving us a chance at something better." Nathaniel's heart ached as he looked at her. "You don't have to thank me, Mia. You and Leo are the ones who survived. You're the real heroes." She shook her head. "No, you didn't just save us from them. You gave us hope. You gave me a reason to believe that there's still good in this world." Her words hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just about rescuing them from the horrors of Sunrise Haven. It was about restoring their faith in humanity, in kindness, and in the possibility of a new life. "I want to give you both a home," Nathaniel said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I want to adopt you, Mia." "Leo, I know the road ahead won't be easy, but I'll do everything I can to make sure you're safe and loved and happy." Mia's eyes widened, and for a moment, she was silent, absorbing what he had said. Then she stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I want that too. I want to be part of something real, something good." Nathaniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride and relief. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The legal process would take time, but Nathaniel knew this was the right decision. Mia and Leo had been through so much, and now it was time for them to build a future together. He would be there every step of the way. In the following months, Nathaniel threw himself into his new mission. His life had shifted in ways he hadn't expected. His work with the authorities continued, and he watched as more pieces of the trafficking ring were uncovered. Eliza Cross was just the tip of the iceberg. There were more people to expose, more children to protect, and Nathaniel wasn't backing down. But his focus had shifted. No longer was he solely driven by the need to dismantle a criminal network. Now, he was fighting for Mia, for Leo, and for every child who deserved a chance at a life free from exploitation. His passion to bring justice to those who had been wronged had evolved into something more profound. He wanted to create change, lasting change, in a broken system that had failed so many. And then came the moment that would change everything. After countless meetings with lawyers, social workers, and officials, Nathaniel sat across from Mia and Leo in the small but warm living room of his home. The adoption process was finally coming to a close. "You know, Mia," Nathaniel said, his voice calm, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." Mia looked up from her book, her curious gaze meeting his. "What is it?" Nathaniel smiled, feeling his heart swell with emotion. "Would you like to take my last name? Would you want to be a part of this family, officially?" For a moment, Mia seemed taken aback. Her eyes flickered to Leo, who was playing with his toy cars on the floor, oblivious to the moment unfolding before him. Mia then stood up, her face serious but filled with something new. a sense of security, of belonging. Yes, yes, I would. I want to be part of this family. I want to be your daughter. Nathaniel's heart swelled with pride and joy. He walked over to her and pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close as tears welled in his eyes. For so long, he had been searching for something meaningful in his life. And now, he had found it. His purpose wasn't just about justice. It was about love, about family, and about healing. As Eliza Cross's trial came to an end, Nathaniel knew that the battle was far from over. She had been convicted of her crimes, but her network, the people who had helped her, the ones who had profited from the suffering of children, was still out there. The justice system had worked in her case, but Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, more to fight for. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had Mia. He had Leo. They had a future to look forward to, a life to rebuild from the ashes of their pasts. Together, they would heal, and together, they would continue the fight for justice. Not just for the children who had been trafficked, but for every child who deserved to live without fear, without exploitation. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the courtroom, watching as the guilty verdict was read aloud. He could feel the weight of the years of work and sacrifice that had led to this moment. But as Eliza was led away in handcuffs, he knew this was just the beginning. His life had changed forever, not just because of what he had done, but because of who he had become. The man who had once been driven only by the pursuit of wealth and success was now driven by something much greater. A deep, unshakable desire to make the world a better place, to create a future where children like Mia and Leo would never have to live in fear again. And as he walked out of the courthouse with Mia and Leo by his side, Nathaniel realized that his mission had only just begun. Together, they would change the world. But this time, they would do it as a family. Thank you all for following this story till the very end. We hope you've had an emotional and thought-provoking experience, reflecting on the values of humanity and sacrifice in life. If you found this story captivating and meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any new videos. Feel free to share this story with your friends and family if you think it could inspire them. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again in the next stories.